SSRS datasets and filters. The end data that you want to display to your users is not always going to be the same. For example, sometimes you want your queries to be a little more dynamic. In this nugget, we're going to review how to add query parameters to the actual query itself, and then we'll also look at filtering. In both scenarios, you are narrowing down the data that the end user is seeing, but the difference is with query parameters, you're limiting the data on the database level, whereas with filters, you're limiting that on the client side. We are going to take a closer look at query parameters such as cascading parameters, and then we'll also look at SQL Server Analysis Services data sources. So you can have your data source coming from SSAS, and you can also perform filtering through there. And then the last thing we'll do is look at our stored procedures. You can actually have a stored procedure serve up the data that you want to display. For example, if you have a data source such as ADO.NET, which doesn't support the query parameters, then you'll be forced to use a stored procedure and pass in the parameters through there. Well, let's get started with query parameters. Here we are in our Business Intelligence Development Studio, and we're just going to create a new project, and we'll make this a report server project. I'll just call this My Projects. And what I'd like to do is right-click on here and add a new data source. So I'll call this My DS1. And the backend database is SQL Server, and here we need to add our connection string. Mine is running on localhost, and I have the choice between using Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. Just make sure that you provide the correct credentials. And then we'll provide the database name. So in our case, it's going to be AdventureWorks DW 2008, and you can hit this test connection just to make sure everything looks fine. Okay, so at this point, if you want to click on credentials, you can always change how the user logs in. I'm going to keep it like it is. And then for our reports, we can say Add New Report. There's our shared data source that we just created. We'll hit Next, and then we'll build our query. So we'll graphically build our query, and then after our query is built, we can add the parameter. Okay, so I'm just going to right-click on here, Add Table, and let's find our employees. So we'll just hit Add, keep this simple, and I'm going to extract the employee key as well as their first and last name, and maybe grab their hire date and email address, and we'll just stick with that. So here's our query down here. We can now narrow it down with a where clause. We can say where, maybe let's do a last name search, where last name equals, and use your @ sign to specify any query parameters. So I'll just say right here LName, and you can even put in an order by clause. So I'll order by the last name and the first name. And now we can hit OK. Now we hit Next. We'll just do tabular, and we'll put everything under the details. And I'll just call this Emp Report. And notice that under Parameters, when you click this plus, at any point if you want to change what this name is called here, also make sure that you change the name in whatever query that's referencing it. So this prompt here is what the end user is actually going to be prompted. So let's make this a little more user-friendly. And the data types can be text, boolean, date, time, integer, or float. We can stick with text. We can also allow blank values or null values. I'm going to allow both of these. For right now, allow multiple values to be unchecked. I'll show you how to support that in just a moment. And then the parameter visibility, well, if you want to allow the end user to choose what the value is, make sure it's set as visible. Okay, so the available values, we're going to keep this just like it is. Available values could be populated with a SQL query to provide some drop-down values if you wanted to, but that really wouldn't make sense for this particular example. We can also provide some default values. Let's keep that at the first option for right now. And then under Advanced, you can specify when to refresh your data. So the default is this first option. You can also specify to always refresh. Depends on how quickly the underlying data changes. Okay, so now I'm going to just hit OK. So now when we preview this report, you'll see that we have this little null thing here, and this is grayed out. If you uncheck that, then you're actually allowed to type something in. So if I type in Johnson and then view the report, I get all the Johnsons in here. Now also notice that if I put Johnson in all uppercase letters and then try to view the report, it's case insensitive. So that's kind of nice. So let's say that I wanted to find a bunch of employees with different last names. Maybe I'm looking for Johnsons and Smiths. Well, I could go back into design mode. I could double click on my L name right here, and under general here we'll allow multiple values, and now you'll see the difference in behavior. Okay, so it gives us a warning here. A multi-value parameter cannot include null values, so let's make sure that we uncheck that, and now go ahead and hit OK. We're almost finished here. That we just need to make one more modification, and that's with the dataset query. So just right click on here, and you'll see the where clause has an equal sign. Well, on the right hand side of the equal sign, we're going to be referencing multiple values, so we can no longer use equals. We have to use the SQL in operator, and then we just put parentheses around here. That's syntactically correct now. So at this point we can hit OK, and now we can preview it. So now when we hit our last name here, we can plug in Johnson and Smith, and now view our report, and here we have Johnsons and Smiths. Now what if you wanted to provide a drop-down list of all of the possible last names for your employees? Well, let's do just that. I'm going to go back into design mode, and I'm going to create a separate data set which just represents a SQL query representing the employees. Okay, so I'm going to right click right here, and we're going to add a data set, and I'll call this emp names. There's the data source that's shared, and here's our query. Let's just go into our query designer. Click right there, right click, add the table. Here's our dim employee table, and we're just interested in returning the employee key as well as the first and last name. What we could do is actually concatenate the last and first name. We can modify this by saying last name and then putting a plus sign, maybe a single comma and a space, and then another plus sign right there. And we'll give this an alias. We'll just call it emp name. And we can do an order by, so the employees don't appear in just some random order. So we'll do an order by last name, comma, first name. You know, there might be more than one Mike Smith, so if you wanted to, you could, tack onto here explicitly the employee's ID as well, just to let the end user know. We're not going to bother with that right now, though. Let's make sure that our query from this data set right here references the appropriate information. And now let's just make sure that our query for this data set is appropriate. So if you right-click on Query, you'll see that it's referencing L name. We don't care about that anymore. What we're interested now is the employee key. So we want to say where employee key equals eKey. We're no longer using L name, so we can go in here, right-click, and delete it. Let's double-click on eKey just to make sure it's set up appropriately. And yes, it is. It's getting the values from our query, from that data set we created. So now we can test this. So you'll see here that we have this drop-down list of all these different employees. Now, it has a label of eKey. That's not really user-friendly. We can go back in there, double-click on eKey, and change the prompt to say employee. Let's preview it again. There it looks a lot nicer. So once again, if you have multiple values in here, such as David Bradley, you might want to modify this underlying query to also include the ID of that employee, because otherwise you don't know which David you're trying to grab. Now let's do an example of cascading drop-down menus. I want you to start off with an empty Business Intelligence Development Studio. We're going to do File, New. We're going to create a new report server project, and let's call this Cascading Dropdowns. And what we're going to do in here is, first of all, create a new data source. So we'll call this Products, since we're going to be extracting information from the products table. Here's our connection string. My server name is localhost. I'm going to use Windows authentication, and my database name is AdventureWorks DW 2008. I test my connection and it looks fine. So we hit OK a couple times. I'm now going to create a basic report that does not contain a where clause. This is going to represent my products, and then we're going to filter it by the subcategory eventually. So we'll say Add New Report, and we'll just hit Next. Here's our query builder. Right click on here, we'll add a table. Here's dim product. Add that, and then close it. And let's just display the product key as well as the English product name and the list price. We can even do an order by clause. Order by English product name. And then hit OK. Hit Next. We'll do a tabular form, put everything in the details, stick with the default look and feel, and we'll call this Product Report. At this point we can preview it and everything will look fine. Okay, so what we'd like at this point are two drop-downs at the top. The first drop-down will be the categories, and the second drop-down will be the subcategories. The subcategories drop-down is going to depend on the first drop-down list. So in other words, it will be a dynamic drop-down. So the way we implement that is we go to our data set right here. Here's our data set that represents the products. I'm going to right click on here and I'll say Add Data Set, and this will represent our categories. So if you just click on Query Designer, and we will right click on here, add a table. And here's our dim product category. So all we want to do here is add the product category key as well as the English product category name, and then also do an order by clause, so it's in a particular order. So order by English product category name. And we hit OK right there. Let's give this a meaningful name. We'll call this Categories. And then we can hit OK right there. At this point I can right click here again, and we're going to do the same thing except this time for the subcategories. The data source once again is products, and we can go into our query designer, add the table, and this time dim product subcategory. Let's extract the product subcategory key as well as the English product subcategory name. We can do an order by English product subcategory name, and we want to have a where clause. We'll say where, and you'll see that there's a field here. You can ignore this warning here. We'll just say ignore. If you scroll down a little bit, there's product category key. So where product category key equals, and let's put a query parameter in here. So we'll just call this cat key. And we'll hit OK. And then OK again. And you'll see that as soon as I did that, under parameters I have this cat key. If I double click on my cat key, I can change the prompt to say category. And under available values, instead of saying none, we're going to get values from a query. Well, the query is categories. The value, in other words, what's getting returned when the user selects something from the drop-down, is product category key, and the label field is going to be the category name. We can hit OK. And now when we hit preview, and now you'll see that we have this drop-down consisting of the categories. Okay, now the next step is to get the subcategories prompt on here. So we go back into design mode, and we're going to modify our query here. Go into query, and we need to narrow this down with a where clause. So we'll say where, and you'll see here, once again, we can ignore this little warning. You'll see that there's this product subcategory key. Equals, and let's call it subcat key. As soon as I hit OK, you'll see that it appears in here. We need to double click on that, and we'll give it a meaningful prompt. And under available values, get the values from a query. Our data set is subcategories. Our value field is the key. Our label is the name. And we hit OK. And now let's test this. So I'm going to click on preview. Let me move this over a little bit so you can see it. And when I select clothing, the subcategory changes. When I click on accessories, once again it changes. And then we can view the report. So that's how cascading drop-downs work. As soon as you put a query parameter inside of a query, then that parameter automatically shows up under parameters. The type of filtering that we implemented a moment ago actually occurred on the underlying database. And for performance reasons, this is considered a best practice. There's another way of filtering data, and that's on the client side. You might encounter a situation such as, if your data source is using ADO.NET, you won't be able to perform filtering on the database level. So if that's the case, you'll want to do that on the client side. What I'm going to do here is create a new project, and I'm going to call this filtering 1. And what we're going to do is just create a simple report that displays employees, and we're going to filter by the last name, but instead of using query parameters, we'll use an actual filter. So I'll just right click on report, we'll add a new report. Here's the data source, and we need to create our connection string. So my server name is localhost. I'm going to use Windows authentication, and my database name is AdventureWorks DW 2008. I hit next, and here's my query builder. I'll just right click on there and add my dim employee table. Whoops, only wanted to add one there. Okay, and we're going to display the employee key as well as the first name and last name, maybe their hire date as well. And we can do an order by last name and first name. No where clause in there. Hit next. We'll do a tabular report, putting all the information under the details. And then we'll just call this emp report 2. When we preview this, there's our information. Oh, it looks like we missed our hire date there. We can go back into design mode and just drag and drop that right there. And that looks great now. Now, as far as narrowing this down, let's go back into design mode. We can go into hire date right here. We can right click on our data set, go to the data set properties, and we can go into filters and add a filter right here. And so you have a little wizard that asks for an expression. So you can deal with text data, date information, numbers, and so on. So if I want to narrow down by the last name, I can say where last name equals Johnson. Or if I wanted to narrow down by the hire date, maybe say that the hire date is between two dates, we can do that as well. So now when we preview this, there's our filtered data. Now I just want to emphasize here that the only time you should use this type of filter is when using query parameters is not available. You can implement these filters also on the data model level if you want to. The next thing I want to show you is grabbing your data from SQL Server analysis services. I'm going to go back into design mode, and we're going to create a new report. Now, when we're prompted for the data source, instead of choosing Microsoft SQL Server, I want you to choose SQL Server Analysis Services, and we'll call this SSAS DS for data source. And then when we try to edit the connection string, we simply put in the host name. Now instead of displaying the databases, it's showing the deployed SSAS cubes. So I'm going to use my sales cube 1. If you don't already have an SSAS project, go ahead and create one. You can test your connection, and then we hit OK. We can make this a shared data source for future use. And then in our query builder, instead of dragging and dropping tables, you'll see now that we have dimensions and we also have measures. So we can simply drag and drop things over here. So for our particular cube here, I can say, you know what, I want to display the sales amount and tax amount by gender. I might also display it by marital status, and then it can be a drill down report. You can perform filtering up here if you want to. For right now, I'm just going to hit OK. We hit Next. We're going to make this a tabular report, and we'll group this by gender, and then we'll put the details for the marital status, sales amount, and tax amount right down there. Let's enable drill down, and then we hit Next. And we'll call this Sales Cube Report. And there we have it. So we can preview this, and you'll see that we have our drill down. We have females there, married females, single females, and of course you could always make these calculated attributes so it spells out the actual word. Just to pretty this up a little bit, let's go ahead and change the formatting for the sales amount and tax amount to be currencies. So we'll just right-click under this sales amount and go to text box properties, and we'll go to number and specify currency. Use the thousand separator and do the same thing for the tax amount. Preview it again, and there we have it. If we go back to design mode and then right-click on your data set right here, go to the data set properties, notice that it's using curly braces, using the dot operator. These are all MDX expressions. Essentially, we're taking slices of dimensions and we're intersecting them to get our result set. Also notice that we have filters. So we can add filters, and it works just the same way as it did before. For example, if we only want to look at the males, we can say gender equals M. So now when we run this, here we only have males. So once again, the filtering is happening on the client side as opposed to the SSAS side. Now, yet another data source that you can implement is that of a procedure. You can define a procedure that takes parameters, and then you can use those parameters inside of a select statement, which is residing inside of the procedure. The advantage of using procedures is that whenever you want to make modifications to the actual underlying query, you don't have to go into the report designer environment and make those modifications. So development goes a little bit faster. I'm going to pull up my SQL Server Management Studio, and here I've already created a procedure called emps by sal. Okay, so here was the syntax that I used. It takes two parameters, a low sal and a high sal, and I'll just make the data types money. And all it's doing is it's selecting star from dim employee where base rate is between the low sal and the high sal. So here is our dynamic data right here. So when you're creating a report, let's go ahead and go back into our Business Intelligence Development Studio. Make sure you go into Design Mode. And now we can go into Reports here, right-click and say Add New Item. We're going to just say Report, and let's call this msft by sal.rdl. And we end up with this just empty report right here. Now what I'd like to do is create a new data source and then a new data set within that data source. So for the data source, let's just stick with the default there. And here's our connection string, localhost. Here's our database, DW2008. And then hit OK. So we now have this data source. Right-click on it to add a data set. And this is where you'll give it a name, msft by sal. And instead of saying text, I want you to say stored procedure. And you'll see that it's now in the drop-down. There's the procedure that should appear in the drop-down automatically. And then we can hit OK. So now that we have that on there, you can go into your toolbox and you can drag a table on there. And then you can drag the different columns on there. So here I'll drag employee key as well as the last name and first name. And we'll also put the base rate in there just so you can see that information. So now when we preview this, you'll see that we're prompted for a low salary and a high salary. So I'll put in here 20 for the low salary, and for the high salary I'll say 25. Let's view our report. And just to verify that it is within that range, take a look at that. Nothing is out of the range. So that is how you use your procedures as a data source. Once again, the benefit of that is it makes development go a lot faster because you don't have to continually go into your reporting service to modify the query. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about simple query parameters. Remember, to add a query parameter, you include a where clause in the underlying query and include an @ sign. Once you do that, then the parameters will automatically show up in your environment. Whenever possible, use query parameters. We also had data-driven query parameters, where the underlying possible values are populated by a SQL query. Make sure to create a separate data source to provide the population. We also included cascading query parameters, where one drop-down list depends on another one. In the underlying query for the dependent drop-down, make sure you reference with an @ sign the first drop-down. We took a look at filters. Filters are used when query parameters are not available. All you need to do is right-click on your data set and go to the Filters tab, and you can add as many filters as you want. We also created SSAS data sources and filters. If you want to use SQL Server Analysis Services to provide a data source, you need to make sure that you first deploy your SSAS cube. You can filter that information using MDX expressions. Remember, it's just the intersection of different dimension slices. Then the last thing we talked about are stored procedure data sets. You'll need to go into SQL Server Management Studio and actually create the stored procedure that takes parameters. And then when you create your data set and specify the stored procedure, when you run your report, it will prompt you for however many parameters there are for your stored procedure. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank